thanks. Good morning, everyone, and everyone here in person in New York. Everyone, I know a lot of people are watching online right now as well, so welcome to all our viewers online. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm on the faculty here at School of International Public Affairs at Columbia, and I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy. And I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank especially our guest, Brian Deese, for being here. As a big member of Red Sox Nation, I wasn't sure if you were going to get out of bed this morning. I'm sorry. But thanks for showing up here in New York. This is a special day for me and for the Energy Center. As you all know, we're really lucky here at Columbia to attract some of the top energy leaders from the public and private sector from all around the world. And even in that heady group, Brian Deese stands out as one of the people who's most shaped U.S. energy policy over the last several years. And it's also meaningful for me personally because he is a friend and my old boss at the National Economic Council. When I say boss, bear in mind that he joined the administration as a 31-year-old Yale Law School student when he was involved in key parts of saving the U.S. economy when it was in the midst of recession, like the auto bailout, and then moved in a meteoric rise through the ranks of the National Economic Council, the Office of Management and Budget, until early last year, President Obama asked him to step into the very large shoes of John Podesta to help oversee the president's ambitious energy and climate agenda for the remainder of President Obama's term in office. And in between, he finds time to deal with small other matters like trying to pick and confirm Supreme Court justices and lots of other things. My colleague David Sandelow from the Energy Center is going to say a bit more by way of introduction of Brian, but I'll just say on a personal note, as someone who worked with him in the White House, I was in awe of Brian on a daily basis. I learned from him endlessly. He's wise beyond his years. He has a frightening ability to quickly master subjects, no matter how complex they are, has exceptional judgment, has the most enormous trust of the president himself, and is not only a wonk's wonk, but has incredibly astute political judgment. And no matter how crazy or chaotic things can get in that building, he's always calm and unflappable and generous and extremely nice. So I was really fortunate to have the chance to work with him, be able to turn to him for advice, and still have the chance to do that over the course of my career. It's really, I think, a role model for a lot of what we teach here at Columbia about what a career in public service can and should look like. So I'm lucky to have had the chance to work with you, Brian. We're lucky to have you here today. And let me turn it over to David Sandelow, who will introduce Brian. I'll just remind everyone again watching online that Brian will speak for about 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll have the chance for some conversation up here. We'll take questions from the audience. Those of you watching online can also submit your questions through Twitter to our handle at Columbia U Energy using the hashtag CGEP events. Please also silence your cell phones. David.
Well, thanks, Jason. It's really fun for me to join you in welcoming Brian Deese to Columbia. Brian Deese is one of the breakout stars of the Obama administration, and I think together Jason and I risk swelling Brian's head even more. I had the privilege of working with Brian in the first Obama term. We worked together on electric vehicle policy, on climate policy, on strategic petroleum reserve issues, on budget issues, and more. And I was amazed as Brian at how quick and incisive he is, at how he combines analytic abilities and creativity. And so I went last night looking for kind of profiles of Brian, and my favorite quote that I found about Brian was from Larry Summers, who, let me say at the risk of understatement, is not a man who is known for high praise and who served as Secretary of Treasury and President of Harvard, and said, quote, "Brian grasps both the economics and the politics about as quickly as I've seen anyone do this." As Jason said, another person who won Brian's confidence is Barack Obama, and that confidence has led to a meteoric rise through the administration. One point I'd like to add, it's not just the titles that Brian has held that are a measure of his influence on the president, but also the geography. And in Washington and in the West Wing in particular, geography is power. And Brian's office now sits between the Oval Office and the Office of the Chief of Staff to the President of the United States. So the president needs to walk by Brian to get to his chief of staff. And it's an office, a small office, that was occupied by people, including John Podesta, Rahm Emanuel, and George Stephanopoulos at previous times in our history. As we were walking in, Brian remembered that the last time that he and I saw each other was in Beijing, where I spent a lot of time. And I was recalling, and said that, how when Brian got his latest position about a year or two ago, I had to vouch for him to the Chinese leadership on multiple occasions, because in China, young people with great authority is not something that is part of the political culture. And people, on several occasions, senior members of the Chinese leadership who I knew asked me, is this for real? And let me say, they do not ask that question anymore. Ladies and gentlemen, Brian Deese.
Well, thank you very much. The risk in these types of things is that after an introduction like that, it can only go downhill from here. Thank you to both of you. That was very kind, if overstated. I want to start by saying it's a real pleasure to be here. When Jason told us that he was going to leave, we were all disappointed to lose him in the administration, but he said that he had this idea and this thing that he was going to go try to work on that at that point, it's only 3.5 or 4 years ago, was literally just an idea. And so it's very, it's exciting for me, gratifying for me to get to be here and see this center and the work that it does and the way that it adds to the community, the intellectual community here. So that's a great testament to you, Jason, but also to the work of lots of people here. And I'm really, I'm glad to have an opportunity to see it in person. I am a Red Sox fan, and so it is also dangerous to travel up to New York City today. But I will say two things that are unique about this event. The first is that I think that this is one of the only rooms in the United States where if I were to start by evoking the transcendent international event that's going to happen 27 days from now, at least half of you might think first to the COP in Marrakesh, Morocco, as opposed to the US election. So it's good to be in that company today. The second is it is nice and in some ways freeing to come and have an opportunity to talk about climate and energy policy at the very end of an administration. We, after all, have only about 105 days left in Barack Obama's term. It's nice, one, because I can be free to some degree of just simply talking our talking points back at you. And it's also nice for you guys because you don't have to listen to me. So with that, I thought what I would do is just offer a couple of impressions that I have looking back on the work that we've done over the last several years. And then offer a couple of quick thoughts about where I think we go from here, and then hopefully spend a lot of our time here having a conversation. I am not going to give a presentation, but I am going to use a couple of pictures, so I'll see if this works. A couple of pictures just from time to time as I talk. So the first impression that I would offer is that a lot changes when we talk about climate and energy policy once it is possible to reduce carbon emissions while growing our economy. This is the chart that is my favorite chart to the degree that my staff has begun to mock me. But I think it's important because if you step back since the Industrial Revolution, it has been a basic tenet of mainstream economics that GDP and carbon emissions grow together. And that growth had lifted many people out of poverty. It's the basis of modern societies. It also created a structural reliance on carbon-based energy systems. That obviously economically has created problems with respect to climate change, but that perceived linkage between affordable energy on the one hand and carbon on the other has also defined the politics of climate change as well. It's hard to convince people to accept a lower standard of living for anything. It's particularly hard to do so when you're talking about something like climate change that by its nature is diffuse and slow moving. But as you can see in this chart, that really now has changed. Since 2010, what this shows is that US GDP grew by roughly 11%, while energy sector emissions fell by about 6%. And this dynamic is not just happening in the United States. There are now more than 20 countries across the world that have actually seen this decoupling of growth and emissions. And it's not just advanced post-industrial economies, even places like Bulgaria, Uzbekistan, that still have expanding industrial sectors, but who are still seeing this dynamic take place. Other studies, other assessments have actually suggested that China may be close to peaking its emissions, and of course its stated growth was 6.9% last year. And globally, if you step back over the most recent 2 years that we have data, the global economy grew by just under 7%, and energy sector emissions stayed flat. So there's something happening here that is different. It is economically significant, and a lot of attention has been paid to that point. But I also think it's very politically important, because our success in reducing emissions over the last several years has not been about sacrifice. It has not been about trading off prosperity today for some hoped or foreseen future benefit. It's been about innovation, it's been about jobs, and it's been about contributing to what is the longest streak of total job growth on record, which we are living through right now. And so I think that this period also allows us to say more unambiguously and with more confidence, and not just outside of the core economics profession, that acting on climate change is actually in our best economic interest. It is the best economic strategy for the country. Without action, we face trillions of dollars in costs. When we think about actually measuring appropriately projected GDP growth, those costs should be built into any baseline assessment of growth going forward. And when you do that, taking a low-carbon development path is far and away the smartest thing to do. And you can now say, why would we ever take the economic risks associated with climate change when we actually have a strategy where you can grow the economy and reduce emissions at the same time? That's not to say that the transition that's happening in our energy sector is free from disruptions, or that this is all a free lunch. Obviously, as we transition, there are costs and there are winners and losers. That point is also one where I think this dynamic allows us to be more creative and more aggressive at addressing that issue. It's why for several years President Obama has called for much more aggressive efforts to help coal communities and workers make their way through this market transition. And the good news is there actually has been some movement in Congress on this, despite the frustrating opposition from some congressional leaders who actually represent these areas. We are making progress, and passing and getting some of these measures done should be a priority this fall when Congress gets back to work in the lame duck session. So I think my first impression is that this dynamic of decoupling is significant. But then that raises a question, which is, what if this is an accident of history? And there is an argument that goes that emissions initially fell, as you can see, because of the recession. And then when economic growth picked up, we happened across the shale gas revolution. And voila, emissions continued to fall as the economy grew. Now, I'm going to set aside the question of whether the shale gas revolution had its roots in public sector research decades ago. And I'll also put aside, although I have noted with some humor over the past several weeks, a number of our most vocal critics have shifted from saying that Obama's job-killing environmental regulations are what's killing the economy to saying, actually, they're not doing anything because it's actually private sector innovation that has driven all of this. So I'm going to put both of those aside for a moment. But I think my second impression is that accidents of history are generally rare, and in this case, breaking the link between growth and emissions is not an accident, and it has and will require sustained policies over time. In 2000, if you look, I think these, even looking back at our most recent projections is instructive in this case. So even in 2010, emissions were projected, this is US emissions, were projected to grow indefinitely for the next decade. In 2014, our projections showed the same. We were stepping down the base, but the growth was basically the same. So, but by 2016, you started to actually see that projecting forward, the absolute reductions in emissions were coming to bear, and that line is consistent with the target that we set, that people like David and Jason and others worked hard to set, of a 17% reduction in emissions by 2020. So the question is, what explains this change and this recent change in the projection of our projected emissions? And shifting from coal to natural gas is part of the picture, but the story increasingly, when you look not just at where we are today on that chart, but when you look forward to the projections, is the result of policy. In the electricity sector, which is the largest source of our emissions, the levelized cost of zero carbon electricity has dropped significantly. These facts are well known, but this chart did a better job of actually showing it than many others. So you see 54% for photovoltaic, 41% for wind, 64% for utility scale solar. And these reductions can be linked to investments made early in 2009 and 2010 in basic research. They can be linked to the extension of tax credits that provide an efficient subsidy for wind and solar. And they can also be linked up to the Clean Power Plan, which, when it takes effect in the early 20s, will extend the market signal and incentive for these types of low carbon technologies as well. In the transportation sector, which is the second largest emitter, there's an even more interesting story going on. In 2015, petroleum consumption was 2% lower than in 2008. So what that basically means is that we use less oil now, even though our economy grew by more than 10%. Very few people predicted that this would happen. This came as a surprise to almost everybody who studies this, and there's several people in this room who study it more closely than I do. If you look at the projections, actual petroleum use in 2014 was more than 25% below what we had predicted in 2003. And projected use now in 2025 is more than 35% below where we thought it would be a little over a decade ago. So there are some demographic reasons that are driving this. People are driving less, and we are getting older as a society. But a principal reason for this is another surprising outcome, which is after 30 or so years of not actually having policy in the fuel economy space, the Obama administration began updating fuel economy standards, first for light-duty vehicles, then for heavy-duty vehicles as well. The same dynamic that I'm talking about here is also at play in the industrial, commercial, and residential sectors, which are our third, fourth, and fifth largest sectors, where you can look at energy consumption today. It's basically holding flat, even though the economy is growing. And that's not a spontaneous phenomenon, but again, in part, directly linked to government efforts. Since the president took office, the Department of Energy has issued 42 new or updated energy efficiency standards. David probably has the scars on his back for some of those. But they're in everything from air conditioners to refrigerators to ceiling fans to washing machines. And we've also seen a proliferation and exciting innovation in the market for energy efficiency technology. Smart metering, smart markets that allow homes and businesses to sell energy savings back to the grid. Again, these things can be linked directly to policy changes. And last, in the industrial sector, the administration has put policies in place to actually set what is a very ambitious goal to reduce methane emissions by 40 to 45% by 2025 as well. So I think that I would make the argument that not only is this decoupling happening, but it's not an accident of history. And in fact, it is directly linked to policies that have now changed the trajectory of where we are projected to go. So then I think the third question, or the third impression I have is, well, But everything that you've just described, the basic policy apparatus you've described, is deeply imperfect. And in fact, if you were starting from scratch, there is no way that you would arrive at the basic solution set that I just described. And of course, as many of you are probably studying or have studied for a long time, theory suggests that a simple nationwide price on carbon would lead to even more economically efficient outcomes. But I guess my third impression would be that it is important to take very seriously the first best nature of a second best policy framework. That's true, again, for the economics and the politics. On the economics, when you look at modeling under an economy-wide carbon price, the vast majority of the initial reductions come out of the power sector. And because the Clean Power Plan, which is based on a clear authority in the Clean Air Act, is market-based, is flexible, allows for trading, much of the initial emissions reductions that we will achieve actually mirror the initial reductions that you would get under a stylized nationwide carbon price. On the political side, I think we just have to all be frank that we live in a political environment right now where the prospects of a de novo national carbon pricing mechanism passing Congress are remote for the foreseeable future. And so we have to push ourselves to ask the question about how to optimize these market-based approaches across sectors and make a second best approach increasingly the best case solution for policymakers who are forced to make those decisions. And the last reason why I think we have to take very seriously this second best approach is that it has enabled and will enable the United States to become a global climate leader. Our domestic leadership in reducing emissions provided the credibility to form a historic partnership with China. And this is now relatively well-trodden ground that the historic announcement with China helped encourage ambition by countless other countries, and that helped lead to the Paris Agreement last December. And in fact, the Paris Agreement itself is a triumph of second-best alternatives. Instead of establishing a top-down global carbon pricing system, Paris relied on this idea of nationally determined ambition, which is by its nature second best, but by doing so, it created a new formula for global action. It broke out of decades of very calcified international discussions and brought forward a new potential approach. But one of the key questions that I got coming out of Paris was whether that was a one-off event. Was it a flash in the pan? Were countries going to fall back into their old ways? And in some ways, that question boils down to whether U.S. leadership on climate, this second best policy approach that we've put forward, would it actually continue to pay dividends internationally and create a sense in which momentum begets momentum in international climate discussions. And while I absolutely did not plan this timing, I stand here at a very interesting 8 or 10-day period for international climate diplomacy because we have a confluence of a number of very significant events coming together. The first is the entry into force of the Paris Agreement. This is a GIF. I'm demonstrating my hipness with technology. It's not at first blush, it looks like this sort of spread of a global pandemic. But what it shows is that this is the path that we took to get to the threshold last week where we hit the threshold for Paris entering into force. More than 55 countries representing more than 55% of global emissions formally ratified and joined the agreement. And as a result, the agreement will now enter into force in early November. Shortly after the agreement was adopted in mid-December last year, there was a lot of discussion about how soon this should happen. Some argued it would be prudent to push for a pre-2020 entry into force, well before 2020 to encourage momentum. Others made a set of arguments that there was value in moving much more slowly to allow certain provisions of the agreement to be developed, perhaps some of them to be revisited and otherwise. But virtually nobody thought that it was possible for the agreement to enter into force this year. What was interesting for me was in the days following Paris, President Obama spoke by phone to President Xi and Prime Minister Modi, as well as President Rousseff, Ban Ki-moon, and others. And he came away from those conversations convinced that if we could get leadership from the major emitters, what seemed improbable was indeed possible, and that entry into force this year in 2016 was the kind of somewhat audacious goal that we should be trying to push for. And the process over the last 9 months has been challenging, torturous at times. It has required overcoming doubters and urging ambition. But the result is an important sign that US climate leadership continues to pay dividends and that momentum is begetting momentum post-Paris. Second, and just last week as well, more than 190 countries came together in Montreal and agreed to cap net emissions from the international aviation sector. They agreed to a system where airlines will now either have to reduce their emissions directly or they will have to purchase carbon offsets for any emissions above the cap. And this fills an important gap that was left by the Paris Agreement. Parties in Paris explicitly agreed that the national plans that countries put into place would not cover emissions from international flights, even if those flights started or originated in your country. And international aviation represents only 2% of global emissions today, and it was complicated, so it was left to the side. But the sector is forecast to grow at rates significantly above GDP growth, which means that this, over time, the international aviation sector poses a threat to Paris's climate goals and temperature goals. And again, a year ago, if we had been having this conversation prior to Paris, I think few in this conversation, including myself, would have thought that getting a workable international global market-based mechanism to constrain aircraft emissions was likely. In part because unlike Paris, a solution here actually requires a global system. It requires a global market-based measure rather than just nationally determined plans. Carriers from different countries fly the same routes. They're in direct competition, and so you can't have different countries just making their own determinations here. But countries are willing to get creative. We created a staged approach which allows for the reflection of countries' different capacities while maintaining the viability of a market-based mechanism. And in addition to getting agreement on this mechanism, countries representing 85% of aircraft emissions have already stepped up and said that they will voluntarily participate early in this new scheme. That includes the big countries like China and the US, but it also includes countries like Guatemala and Kenya, who are all stepping forward to say this is important. So this is a second place where we're seeing momentum beget momentum in the international climate space. And I would note as a sidebar, in this area, we've now seen a compelling blueprint for reducing emissions in a market-based manner at the global level that I think will actually become a model for other sectors as well. Lastly, again, because everything seems to be convening in these last 8 or 10 days, right now in Kigali, Rwanda, there's a meeting of the parties to negotiate a potential amendment to the Montreal Protocol to phase out the use of hydrofluorocarbons or HFCs. An ambitious amendment that could come out this week could avoid up to 0.5 degree of global temperature increase by the end of the century. It would be the most important and significant step that the international community could take to make good on Paris's promise. Now, I can't tell you how this one's going to end because our negotiators are literally there on the ground. It's one of the reasons why I have to get back to DC later today. But I will say that already we have over 100 countries that have signed on for an ambitious amendment in this context. We already have donor countries and philanthropies making the single biggest contribution to financing in this context for energy efficiency ever made. So I remain optimistic that despite twists and turns, we have a path to get to a third very concrete data point that we are seeing increasing momentum coming out of Paris. So there's that. I think decoupling of growth and emissions is here to stay. I think it's not an accident of history. And while our policy architecture is inherently second best in the United States, it is paying real dividends, which have only increased internationally post-Paris. So where do we go from here? Let me just offer a couple very brief thoughts. First, I think we are all going to have to pay more attention to optimizing and harmonizing a sector-by-sector approach to reducing emissions. It is not the first best, but it merits further scrutiny, it merits further study, it merits further innovation, including by centers like this, because it is likely to be the dominant paradigm for the foreseeable future. That means things like making it easier and more attractive to adopt market-based regulatory approaches, encouraging trading wherever feasible, is something that the EPA is very focused on. It means aligning the implied carbon prices between sectors as the next generation of fuel economy standards, energy efficiency regulations, and power sector reforms are contemplated. It means working more closely as regions, including for us with Canada and Mexico, on regional markets. And it means improving private sector climate disclosure and practices so investors can allocate private capital more efficiently. This doesn't mean abandoning economy-wide solutions, but given where we are, I think a lot more brain power is going to need to go into optimization going forward. Second, in going forward, in the future, we're going to have a lot more conversation about what is the least discussed component of our climate strategy, and that is land conservation. The president traveled to Midway Island in the middle of the Pacific, in part to protect the largest marine reserve on the planet, but also to make the argument that climate and conservation are increasingly going to be linked. That's important for protecting natural spaces. It's increasingly going to become an economic imperative to actually hit emissions reductions goals. That's particularly true if the policy architecture that I just described works, because squeezing additional reductions out of the power sector in particular is going to become increasingly difficult. This is going to require fundamentally rethinking policy. Over the last several years, we've improved the measurement of our sinks. We've invested in research that promotes climate-smart land management and agriculture and developed new business models for conservation. But we're going to need to do a lot more. We're going to need to find ways to implement pay-for-practice incentives so that negative emissions actually become one of many commodities that farmers and foresters can generate. We're going to need to think much bigger about reforesting. We're going to need to ensure we're using U.S. lands as efficiently as possible, promoting smart growth, using agricultural subsidies to actually incentivize efficient conservation practices, and supporting innovative strategies like precision agricultural to support low-carbon bioenergy crops. If we get this right, this could lead to some of the most efficient and significant emission reductions in our economy, but it's also going to require significant policy creativity in the future. Third point, we cannot ignore what's happening all around us, even as we accelerate mitigation efforts. The issues associated with adapting to climate change and making our country more resilient keep getting louder and louder. We've seen that just this weekend. We've seen the devastation that Hurricane Matthew has wrought in the Caribbean, but also Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas now. And we know that the frequency and severity of natural disasters like hurricanes and droughts are increasingly rapid, and we need to deal with their impacts, even if we succeed on the mitigation front. Again, the administration has taken several steps in this space, but we're going to need to do a lot more. We're going to need to fully embed climate resilience into the way our federal agencies operate. We are going to need to move away from this idea that you pay for rebuilding after the disaster strikes and move toward rewarding resilience efforts before the storm gets there. We're going to need to have very tough conversations about things like the federal flood insurance program and start to recognize what major insurance companies are recognizing, which is the 100-year flood standard is less useful when 100-year floods are occurring every 5 years. We have to think about practices that expose the federal balance sheet and taxpayers to big lingering liabilities. And we're going to have to tackle very significant problems here in the United States about what we do about resettling climate refugees, where we've already seen the first of those in places like Louisiana and Alaska. Other countries around the world face far more significant challenges on that front, but we're going to have to face those for ourselves and our citizens as well. And the last thing I think we need to do pointing forward is we need to believe in the proposition that momentum and speed and ambition are actually possible on the global stage. It's easy to be cynical, but I think that the period of the last year, the last calendar year, should give people reason for optimism. And just as the idea of Paris entering into force this year went from an impossibility to an inevitability, we have to set our sights higher and be somewhat more audacious about pushing the envelope internationally. In the near term, that means building out Paris's essential reporting and review requirements. We need a system that is transparent, uniform, and independently verifiable. It means encouraging other countries to pursue steadily more ambitious nationally determined targets, not just around the 5-year cycles, but even now. Only 6 months after Paris, we announced with the Canadian and the Mexican government a North American partnership where we upped our goal for clean energy production continent-wide. We need more collective actions like this so countries can actually see that faster and more ambitious action is possible, and it will be rewarded both by donor countries and by the private market. And finally, it means continuing to fill the gaps in the Paris Agreement that are inevitable when you have a bottom-up and nationally determined structure. Applying models like we just saw in aviation to other sectors, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and export finance for high-pollution projects, and radically scaling up clean energy R&D and green finance, in part by making sure that new and exciting mechanisms that we've put forward, like mission innovation and the Green Climate Fund, become effective management tools and succeed going forward. So that's a full plate. We've got 4 months left, so I can guarantee you that we won't get all of that done. But I think it underscores for me that this is a very exciting time to work on climate policy. And it's also a little scary. The president was asked last week to give a grade on his global efforts to combat climate change. And he gave us an incomplete. And I think that that's fair, because as far as we've come, the problem is accelerating, and the science is increasingly clear that the problem is getting worse faster than our efforts to address it. But we have put in place the frameworks necessary to begin to get at this challenge. And so I think as we come to the administration, that is worth noting, however briefly, before we get back to work for the next 4 months. Thank you. Okay, we're moving over here.
We get stools now.
Okay.
That was great. A tremendous overview of the 8 years of work that the Obama administration has put in to the issue of energy and climate change. And we're going to post those remarks online as well, so people can take a closer look at them, because they were rich with a lot of details and a lot of information. So a reminder again for everyone watching online, we're here with Brian Deese, Senior Advisor to the President, responsible for implementing the energy and climate agenda in the White House. We'll take questions in a little bit from the audience, and people can also ask questions through Twitter at Columbia U Energy, hashtag CGEP events. I'm just going to sort of ask a couple of follow-up questions on some of the stuff you talked about, but let me start by asking, you described a lot of progress, not enough progress, but a lot of progress. As you said, there's a couple of months left, and there's an election in less than 30 days. Depending on the outcome of that election, how much of that progress, if a president were inclined to do so, could be rolled back, could be reversed?
Well, I think that the good news is that if you look at the underlying trends, increasingly what we are seeing is that the private markets are moving now in the direction of cleaner and lower carbon solutions. So if you look in the power sector, for example, the Clean Power Plan is the principal policy tool that we've used to try to create a market-based way of constraining emissions. But if you look at what utilities are saying, their conversation that they're having is very different from the political and partisan conversation that happens in the halls of Congress and even sometimes on the campaign trail. They are, because of market forces that have been at play now for several years, that have been nudged by regulatory steps, they are now making investments and pointing forward to lower carbon approaches. And I don't think that that is going to change. The other thing is it's important to look at the particulars of the sort of second best policy architecture that I was talking about, because even in the power sector, it's not just the Clean Power Plan. And I mentioned when the president came back from Paris, one of the first things that he did upon his return was work to negotiate a multi-year extension of tax credits for wind and solar out into the 2020s. That is projected to generate 100 gigawatts of renewable energy, and that is now law. And I don't think that there's I think that there's very little likelihood that that would get revisited. And so I think that that is true when you look across other sectors as well. Obviously, all of the things that I just talked about in terms of the things we're going to need to do, we're going to need more ambition and more urgency over time. But I also think that a lot of the what's happening in the markets today is going to continue because of what we've seen happen over the last several years.
And then with the prospects for action in Congress on climate seemingly remote, at least right now, can you talk about if the next administration were inclined to do more, what are the big things with existing executive authority that you didn't get a chance to do that could be done? And then secondly, what will it take, do you think, is there any prospect of actually getting some action in Congress? It wasn't that long ago that Republicans supported cap and trade, that was seen as a potential area for bipartisan compromise. Seems like a long time ago now. You're a student of politics as well as climate and energy. What could change that dynamic and make it possible to get congressional action?
Well, I think to the first part of your question, I think about it in terms of the sectors of the economy and the emissions profile and where we can do more. In the power sector, it's going to be important that we move forward with the Clean Power Plan, that we continue to have incentives for zero carbon energy in place, and that's going to take work going into the future. I mentioned that the president had put particular focus on methane emissions. That is, and set a goal, a 40 to 45% reduction by 2025. We have put in place, I think, the foundation to get there, but that's going to be something that's going to require significantly more work in the future. And then in the transportation sector, there's another round of fuel economy standards, a midterm evaluation that will need to take place. But more fundamentally, there's a transformation going on in our transportation sector right now that is being driven by the combination of rapid advances in electrification and rapid advances in autonomous vehicles. And so navigating those two dynamics, encouraging innovation while at the same time encouraging maintaining a framework that people believe in and trust in terms of when they get in their cars and they get on the roads, is going to be a very complicated but also extraordinarily interesting area for the future. Look, in terms of Congress, there's lots of productive things that Congress could do right now and could do in the future that would help support a more coherent energy policy that are bipartisan and don't get you back into the really fraught politics of something like cap and trade. So I mentioned the package of support for coal communities. That's straightforward. It's bipartisan. There is an economic justification for doing that. They should do that now. There's a whole set of issues around smarter and better incentives for energy efficiency investment that there's good bipartisan work going on in Congress again, and there's no reason why you couldn't move that forward, which would provide another set of tools to try to support this overall effort. You know, I think the question of whether and when the Congress comes back to an overarching solution is a more challenging one, and I think the thing that will be the most helpful in supporting that is actually being able to demonstrate that this idea that of delinking emissions growth from economic growth, I think is at the core of it, because for too long, the partisan argument against doing anything on climate change was that climate change isn't real. But then once we've moved away from that, at least in the mainstream debate, it's now that it's just too costly, that maybe we should do something about it, but it's just too costly and the costs are not worth bearing. So I think that that's the next hurdle, and I think that the good news is that the substance bears out that that's actually not the case. But as it is often the case, our politics is probably going to have to catch up to the substance.
You mentioned fuel economy, the transition to electric vehicles. How big a headwind is very cheap gasoline? And then more broadly, because you're a student of both energy and climate and also the economy, you know, there's sort of a pattern in D.C. when gasoline is cheap, we become complacent. When it's expensive, politicians run around like with their hair on fire about what a big problem this is. Because we're a big consumer, we're still a net importer, even though less of one. So cheaper oil is better. And the most recent economic report of the president noted that the actual positive impact to GDP of cheap oil is much smaller than would have been the case in the past, in part because we're a much larger producer. So is it clear that cheaper oil is better?
Well, I'm laughing because of the time that Jason was in the administration, it coincided with a time of reasonably high gas prices. And so when he's referring to people running around trying to figure out what to do when gas prices are high, I think he's also hearkening back to his own experience where we all ran around a bit at points. Look, I think it is the case that the oil intensity of our economy has come down. And so therefore, the economic impact, we are less economically dependent on oil, which is a good thing, and which is something that we should aspire to continue going forward.
The positive impact of a price fall may be lower, but the negative impact of a price spike is also lower.
That's right. That's right. But at the same time, I think it's important that we have the long view, and prices will go back up again. That is the nature of the commodity. It's the nature of the geopolitical situation. And so it would be very short-sighted to take from a period of relatively low oil prices that we should move off of the types of strategies that will encourage us to become more independent from oil going forward.
And so I mentioned sort of the significant increase we've seen in oil and gas production through shale development, which has been an area that's been a positive for GDP. But as you said, I mean, your talk was about the urgency of doing more on climate and how that the impacts and the urgency of the challenge, the science continues to move even more quickly than action does. So this is something, as you know, that's an area of a lot of tension and controversy. The question of this administration has made clear it believes you need to move aggressively to deal with the urgent threat of climate change at the same time that there's been a revolution in domestic hydrocarbon production. Is there, in your mind, a tension between those two things? Can they be reconciled? There's a growing movement to oppose new infrastructure and leases and permits and actually make it more difficult to extract hydrocarbons. How do you think about those?
So I don't want to write off the tension, but I think that there is a way of reconciling it, which is if we are going to seriously meet the challenge that climate poses to our economy and the global economy, we are going to have to move as fast as we can toward an economy that is driven by clean energy, and we're going to have to do as much as we can to reduce emissions, including from areas like the land sector, where it's not just going to be feasible to take it all out of the power sector or the transportation sector. Because of the energy system that we have in place right now, that is going to require a transition. But I think that the policy question that we face and that others will face in the future, I think the right way of thinking about the policy question is what is a reasonable and economically efficient set of incentives to put in place to encourage that transition as quickly as possible. So I'll give you one concrete example that goes to this issue, which is we faced, when we were looking at the Clean Power Plan, a question and a concern about whether, because of where natural gas prices are currently, if you created a system that that was along the lines of what was in the proposed rule, the initial version that we put out, that you might actually encourage overbuilding of natural gas early in order to sort of rush to compliance with the initial phase of the Clean Power Plan in a way that if you looked out at models to 2030 or 2035, you would not actually want to encourage. And so one of the things we did between the proposed rule and the final rule was to modify what the front portion of the Clean Power Plan looked like and actually push back the start date from 2020 to 2022, but also put a clean energy incentive program on the front end that actually uses, rather than the mandatory targets, but incentives on the front end to try to encourage earlier deployment of clean energy. Now, if you still look at the Clean Power Plan and you look at the projections at the end of the at 2030, the end of the projection window, we still will be reliant on coal and natural gas. They will still be part of our power sector. But that type of policy question is, I think, one where we have to take very seriously about how can you move more quickly to the cleaner outcome that you want.
And what do you think, one specific area where this generates a lot of controversy, particularly in New York State, is about natural gas and this idea that it's a bridge fuel, and other people, so like you said, say, well, you're just going to encourage a build out of gas, and then without carbon removal technology, that isn't going to work in the long term. How do you think about the role of gas in this transition?
Well, I think about it, you know, I guess I would apply a sort of a fuel neutral or a technology neutral lens to what I said, which is I think you need to take that approach independent of what fuel you're talking about. So the question is, how can you move most quickly, but also efficiently and safely, and not do things that would impose, you know, unjustifiable burdens on people today, and not do things that would take extraordinary risks with localized air pollution or water pollution or otherwise. So I think that I think it the same. I don't think you apply a different approach when it comes to the question of natural gas, but I think you need to ask those policy questions, and they're legitimate to take very seriously.
You talked about Paris. I think you used the frame, a new formula for international action. So Paris was lauded as a success. I think my view, rightfully so. But you know, people have asked, well, it doesn't actually, these are promises, there's no guarantee countries are going to fulfill them. The commitments made in Paris also don't get you to 2 degrees or as far as you need to go. So tell us a little bit about the theory of the case behind this new formula for international action. How do you see it playing forward to get where, you know, the Obama administration and others have said we have to go?
Yeah. So, you know, you make 2 statements. You can make 2 statements about Paris. One, it's extraordinarily historic international achievement, biggest thing to ever happen on climate change. On the other hand, it's totally insufficient. And on its face, if you add up the commitments from the INDCs, they don't put the world on a straight line trajectory to the 2-degree target, or the probability that they do is not that high. And I think both are absolutely right. And so the theory behind Paris is that in order to solve the climate crisis, every country is going to need to act. That when 2/3 of emissions are coming from developing countries, even if the US, the EU, other developed countries went to 0 today, we would still have a very significant climate challenge in the future. So all countries need to act. But if that's going to be the case, you need to have a nationally determined structure, because both politically and economically, it's not feasible to impose a globally mandated solution on countries that find themselves in such extraordinarily different circumstances. So the theory behind success, how does that become a success, is that that the Paris framework requires all countries to report, review, and independently verify their progress toward their national targets, and then to set subsequent targets every 5 years, and encourages increasing ambition. So the theory of success is that that process of reporting and review and subsequent rounds of setting targets will encourage greater ambition over time. But I think that, as I mentioned before, I think there is a lot of reason for optimism on that front, and what's happened in the 9 months since Paris, I think should give people reason for optimism, but absolutely shouldn't give people reason for complacency. Because in order to actually go to a country like India or a country like Indonesia and say, you need to set another 5-year target, and it needs to be much more ambitious than the target previously. If we collectively haven't demonstrated that the cost of deployable clean technologies in those countries has come down meaningfully since then, or the availability of capital to make those investments at reasonable costs isn't there, then it's going to be a very tough sell. So I think it provides a framework. That's the theory behind it, but it means there's a lot of work to get us from here to there.
Just a quick question on sort of the prospects for action in Congress, which you seem pessimistic about. There is a lot of talk of tax reform. Is there any possibility that a carbon tax could be part of that conversation?
I don't think that type of approach is on the near-term horizon. I think that there is we do still have a disconnect where the congressional politics of this issue have not caught up with either the substance of the issue, the urgency of the issue, or what's actually happening in terms of the speed at which you're seeing transformations in our economy. So, but that's my personal view.
Last question, and while I'm asking that, I'll ask anyone with questions to line up at the microphone here, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. But I want to ask you a question not about climate, but what might be the question most on people's minds, which is how can we be you? So we're training some of the world's next leaders here in public policy. I'm not saying everyone before they're 40 will have the office between the president and the chief of staff, but you know, advice for people who are interested in careers in government in terms of what you've seen in your own?
Well, I think, I guess a couple of thoughts. The first thing is by being here, you've already done a lot of the significant work, which is to get interested in these issues, pursue these issues, find a place like this center and this school to study them is important. I think that the second thing that I would say is get engaged in public service. That this is a time, and particularly this moment right now, that we find ourselves is a time of extraordinary unease in the country, and there's a pervasive sense that the kind of default presumption is to demagogue the notion of public service. And my experience, I had never been in government before January 2009, and my experience in government is that you get to work with an extraordinary group of very talented, highly professional people who want to figure out how to do the right thing. And so it's a real opportunity. So the second thing I would say is look for ways to be involved in public service, and that could be at the federal level, it could be at the state and local level, it could be in trying to influence the conversation. I met with some students who are just now, in the next couple of days, heading out to Morocco, where the COP will be in Marrakesh about a month from now. And they are spending a month trying to figure out how they can do better grassroots organizing on the ground to try to help influence things that will never get the headlines. But if you believe what I just said, the question of that structure of the reporting and review mechanism within the bowels of the Paris Agreement could actually be the difference between whether or not we are successful over the next 10, 15, 20 years at changing the trajectory of this issue. So there's a lot of ways to do it, but I just encourage people to look for ways. And I guess the last thing I will say is, which was one of the last points I tried to make, is be audacious and question the presumption that you can't radically change the status quo. I think over the last couple of years, particularly in the international space, we have seen more progress in things that have been well-settled expectations for years, if not decades, changed relatively quickly. And so change can happen relatively quickly, but part of the essential element is having a set of people willing to fundamentally question why it is that those things can't change. And generally speaking, young people are better at that than older people.
So we have a lot of questions, more than usual. Maybe you were less clear than our usual speakers. Everyone needs clarification.
Perfect.
And maybe what we'll do is take 2 or 3 at a time and give you a chance to respond to get as many as possible. If people could be brief and just quickly introduce yourself.
My name is Bob Wyman, New York resident. My apologies. I hope you don't mind a question from an old guy who's trying to get things changed. The president should be praised for having fought and supported the Section 48 and 25D tax credits for solar and wind. But the cost was very high. The Republicans got the ability to export oil, and they did not extend the tax credits on geothermal heat pumps, small wind, combined heat and power, and fuel cells. The result is that all of those industries lose all tax incentives at the end of this year. This matters to us particularly in a state like New York. In New York, while it's great that we've got solar and wind tax credits, only 18% of our carbon emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions, come from electricity, either its production or its consumption. 35% comes from heating fuel. In this state, as the Public Service Commission said in their response to the Clean Power Plan, we would get a much bigger bang for our buck if we focused on addressing our thermal needs, our heating and cooling needs, as opposed to our electricity production. Yet, as far as I can see,
get to a question.
Yes, as far as I can see, President Obama has never even spoken the words heat pump in his entire administration. And we're getting no support from the White House in fighting for the extension of the 25D and the Section 48 tax credits for the abandoned technologies. In this region, electricity isn't that important. What's important to us is transportation and heating. How do we get policies applied at a national level that don't ignore these important regional characteristics, as the policies that we have currently do?
Thank you. You want to take one?
Yeah, I'll take
a few
couple, and I'll take 3 at a time, and then
Great.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you for this fascinating conversation, and I appreciate the Obama administrations and your mentioning land conservation as important. And I'm concerned about sort of one of the elephants in the room that really isn't discussed. It isn't discussed at the national level, and it wasn't discussed in Paris, and that's the most polluting industry on the planet, which is animal agriculture, which currently occupies about 45% of the land mass, uses 50% of America's fresh water, and as you mentioned, methane is a concern. Methane emissions on the rise. Methane and animal agriculture contribute more to global warming than transportation, the transportation sector. I'm hoping the Obama administration will have the courage to discuss animal agriculture and the future of animal agriculture and the steps we can take to modify our habits.
What they're going to do on
going
agriculture?
forward. Because if animal agriculture's
I think we
practices
understand
aren't
the problem.
modified,
What's the question?
it's sort of game over. How will the Obama administration, what's their position on animal agriculture 10 years out, 20 years out, 30 years out? How do we pivot, change behavior so climate change doesn't, go beyond a point where the planet is sustainable?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for being here and all of the work that you're doing. Jesse Gerson, I'm the head of policy at the Clinton Climate Initiative. And my question for you is, should the Clean Power Plan continue to be stalled in the courts or fail, what would be your second best policy recommendation to the new administration as an alternative to meet our obligations under the Paris Agreement?
The second best of the second best.
Third best. Okay. All right. I'm going to do lightning round so we can get to as many questions as possible. So on the first issue, it'd be is specific and more general. We're quite aware of the incremental extensions that weren't included last time. We have been working closely with our congressional allies, and we want to see those get done. There is a question, as there often is in these circumstances, about whether the best way to get something done is to have the president go out and make it a big thing about him, or whether to actually try to make this something that has bipartisan support so it could actually get done in the end game. And so that's a calibration that we make. But in terms of the position, we want to see those get done, and we are working closely, particularly with Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi, who are very focused on that issue as well. On the question of animal agriculture, I think that this is I think this is an extraordinarily important issue, because I think that we have in our administration acknowledged the need to have a more climate-friendly approach to how we raise and grow food here in the United States. But if you look forward, particularly 2025, 2030, 2035, if we achieve what we're hoping in the electricity sector and the transportation sector, the incremental cost of an incremental unit of abatement out of those sectors, as opposed to better optimizing the land sector in the United States, really starts to shift. So the time to think about more creative policy solutions is now. This is part of what the point I was trying to make, though. These aren't easy questions, and I actually think that this is a place that is going to need more smart thinking about how do you do that without just assuming a technological innovation in a way that maintains our food supply, doesn't disrupt the way of life for farmers and ranchers and others across this country. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in markets. And we have markets right now and federally backed, taxpayer-backed markets in terms of crop insurance and otherwise that produce a market outcome that is not about conservation. It's not clear what it's about. And there's a real opportunity to make improvements there. On the third one, this is one that I happily get to duck because I am in my current position, and I'm also entirely confident the Clean Power Plan is going to survive and is going to go into place. So at least for the time being, I don't have to speculate about what the third best is.
It may be related to that other item I mentioned on your plate about Supreme Court justices. Let's take 3 more questions, please.
Okay, Brian, thank you for coming. I'm Ken Kramer from Rushton Atlantic, a financial consulting firm. I'll try to be succinct. You mentioned methane emission caps, at 22 times CO2. This is obviously bad stuff. I don't know how explicitly it's addressed in the Paris Treaty, but do you have statistics on, what percentage of warming around the world is coming from non-CO2 greenhouse gases, and how specifically other major emitters are looking at methane, and, what is the worldwide reaction of the oil and gas industry, who would probably perceive itself as the main victim of these?
Yeah. Okay.
Do you want to
sorry.
take? We'll
No,
take
no.
two
Go
more.
ahead. Go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Lindsay Iverson. I work at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you very much for your time this morning. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on the comments you made toward the end of your talk on climate adaptation and talk about what you think the most important successes of the Obama administration have been on climate adaptation, particularly in the international sphere, and what you think the most important sort of remaining things to be done are for the next administration.
Great. One more question, please.
Hi, my name is Joanne Dixon. I work in power market restructuring and infrastructure development in emerging markets. I noticed on your global pandemic slide that some of the major oil producers, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Gulf countries, haven't signed on yet, whereas Mexico, maybe some others, have. And so I wanted to know from your opinion, is it a more simple issue of the oil industry being a blocking force, or are there more complex political, economic externalities?
Good. So first on methane, I don't have at my fingertips the stats on non-CO2 internationally. I will say, though, a couple things about this. The first is that unlike some other challenges, at least in the United States, this is one where we should be able to find very economic ways of solving it, because fugitive methane is a cost to the producer, or put differently, capturing the methane is a potential economic benefit. So a lot of this goes to the technology and the certainty of the regulatory environment to create a situation in which companies can actually do what is largely in their best interest. Now, there's lots of complexities about incremental costs that need to be made and all the like, but I think the opportunity in this space is one that is different from in other areas because of that economic opportunity. From the Obama administration's perspective, we've tried to take a cross-sectoral approach to reducing methane, because the industrial emissions are the most significant contributor, but there is an agricultural component to this, and there's other steps that need to be taken. In the industrial sector, though, we have moved regulations for new and modified sources, and we've taken a step that's called an ICR, which basically requires the entire industry to report at a very granular level what is happening at their wells and at their facilities. That will lay the groundwork for an efficient regulatory approach for existing sources.
And this is based on recent work showing the extent of leakage is higher than previously thought.
That's right. That's right. On the adaptation side, well, you asked about international, so I will go there. But I think that a couple of things that I would note that I think are the most significant. The first is that I wouldn't underestimate the degree to which providing data and technical assistance to low-resource countries can really help change the game. So one of the things that we found to be the most effective is actually creating these data toolkits and sharing them with other countries that give them the ability to monitor for weather systems in a more precise way, so that they can actually start to put in place planning for how to avoid the worst impact of natural disasters, which are increasingly likely, but things like hurricanes and floods are things you can actually get better at projecting. The second big thing internationally is that we, as a donor community, are going to have to generate more resources to invest in resilience and adaptation in countries that are less resourced. In Paris, one of the announcements that we made that got, I think, lost in the sea of it, but was very significant from the U.S. government side, was a commitment to double our public grant-funded adaptation to developing countries.
that's the kind of thing we're going to need to see more of. And I think in Marrakesh, one of the conversations I anticipate is as you talk about the $100 billion and the work that donor countries are doing to mobilize finance, how can more of that go into addressing adaptation needs of countries? The oil producers question, you were smartly studying that map. That's it's not, there's no signal there. I think that's just noise in the sense that both Saudi and Nigeria, but the other major oil producers, even Russia, have all indicated their intention to join the Paris Agreement this year in most cases. And I think the issues there are more in terms of the bureaucratic process to get it done than any sort of ideological resistance.
I'll take final 3 questions, please.
Okay, great. My name is Lou Blaustein, and I'm a consultant at the intersection of green and sports and write a blog called Green Sports Blog. So I want to thank President Obama for actually talking about the power of sports to advance a green agenda, which he did last week when the Penguins came to the White House. I'm also a Yankee fan, so I have no sympathy for you at all. But I'm also, I also volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby, CCL. I don't know if you know about that.
Sure.
And so I want to push a little bit on the impossibility, the political impossibility of a carbon tax. We're advocating for a carbon fee and dividend in which the dividend from the price on carbon goes right back to the citizenry, avoiding pretty much the government, which theoretically should get Republican support or be able to. What do you think of that approach?
Thank you.
My name is Maham, and I'm a sustainability management student here at Columbia. My question is regarding the grid resiliency and the outdated grid that we have right now, especially in New York and in a lot of other cities that kind of hinders energy efficiency when it comes to saving costs there. So, and that hasn't kind of changed over the past few years. So how do you think the government plans on incorporating energy efficiency and the incorporation of renewable energy power uncertainty to the grid, to the resiliency of the outdated grid? And my second question is regarding the off-grid rural areas in the developing world, and how do you think the developed world can assist in the leapfrog of those areas so that they don't have to go through the transition of oil-dependent energy?
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Bob Harris, an alum. Thank you for a very informative presentation and for your trip up here. We really appreciate it a lot. Is China still fully cooperating with Obama on climate change, despite the increasing, geopolitical tension between the two?
Good question. Thanks.
Good question. Okay. Well, on the first one, I just want to clarify on this question. I think I am not. I don't want to discourage people from doing work on or advocating for nationwide carbon price approaches. I think that innovating in that space, including the idea, of the question of how to, of what happens and how you recycle the revenue, is obviously a big and important one, and there are virtues to understanding and playing out different approaches. My assessment is just in the near term, I think that the politics are very challenging. And then the second thing I will say is that in the near term, I think there has been less rigorous and intense study on the question of how you optimize a sector-by-sector approach. So my argument is not to try to dismiss or downplay or encourage people against arguing and advocating for a sort of clean economy-wide approach, but instead to encourage a kind of a tandem focus on how you optimize in a world where there's going to be a next round of the regulatory approaches that have been put in place. And there's a big difference between those being done in a harmonized way with people who are thinking about markets and trading than in a scattershot way. And so I think there's a real opportunity there. On the grid question, look, this may be one of the most interesting and complex and real-time questions that's happening right now in terms of how you, states in particular, or states are the particular regulatory agency in most cases, although there's a FERC role to say, how do you effectively encourage deployment of distributed energy resources and intermittent energy resources in a way that maintains stability but tries to maximize innovation. And this is one of these policy questions where, to go back to your question about the bridge versus transition and all of that, where I think that the right policy steer on any of these particular questions has to be, how can you accelerate as quickly as possible without undue risk or unbearable cost, that transition, and all of the challenges in the grid, particularly in areas where they're now getting to higher deployment of intermittent sources, I think reflect that domestically. There is also the basic resilience and infrastructure component of updating our grid, and that's a place where we really should be able to work to put more money into updating our grid, which is a high-value infrastructure investment that I actually think that is a place that you could actually work successfully with Congress to do something significant in that space. And then in terms of developing countries, this is I think, or areas that have need for off-grid solutions. This is one of the most exciting opportunities, but challenges if you take a country like India, where for so many of their different power needs, conventional fossil technology doesn't make any sense, because what they need is an off-grid solution that's not a sort of big stationary source, grid integrated power source. But at the same time, the only way that that's going to happen is if you have deployable technology and you have an investment environment that can do that at a cost that private investors will bear. I think we have tried and are going to continue to try one of these areas of work for the next 4 months to do everything we can with incentives from the federal level, the US level, to try to make markets and overcome some of the cost barriers, encourage innovation in that space. But if you want to ask one of these places where you're going to need a lot more focus in service of making that Paris cycle work in a virtuous way, you put your finger on it there. The China question, that's a great question. We have found consistently, in a way that it really hasn't let up, that the Chinese have continued to be a very constructive partner on the climate issues, even over the course of this year, notwithstanding the fact that we have a lot of issues in our relationship right now, and have had for some time, that are tough and where we disagree with each other. And one of the things that President Obama and President Xi have done, and they did it most recently when the president was in Hangzhou for the G20 summit, was be able to have a very frank exchange and a very frank dialogue and identify the areas where we disagree, and we disagree on very significant issues, but then also be in a position to not let those disagreements get in the way of us identifying areas where we can agree and we can work together. And so even in Hangzhou, we were able to join the Paris Agreement together jointly. But I would note, when we were there, the headline was the Paris Agreement, that both President Obama and President Xi jointly deposited their instruments with Ban Ki-moon. It was very significant. It helped increase momentum in early September. But if you look at what we were able to agree with the Chinese in that context, you'll see that we put forward a template for how the ICAO International Aviation negotiation could be resolved, and China in that context indicated that it would step forward and would voluntarily participate early. That didn't get headlines when we were in China because they were joining Paris, and it's international aviation, and it's a little complicated. But that's another example where we worked very hard and very closely with them to try to establish that as a way to encourage a positive outcome in that context. We did the same thing on HFCs, and obviously, as we sit here today, I can't tell you what's going to happen there. So I think that it is an example of an enduring dynamic with the Chinese that actually hasn't changed all that much over the course of this year, where it's in their interest to continue to cooperate and nudge each other to be more ambitious on climate. It's in our interest to do so, and we found a way to do that without letting our disagreements overwhelm.
Great. Well, we went a few minutes over, which we don't normally do, but there was a lot of questions, a lot of interest. I appreciate all of your staying. I appreciate, Brian, you're taking the questions and staying. That was enormously informative and substantive and comprehensive talk. Whether you agree and support this administration's energy policies or not, I think we can all be grateful that there are people like Brian serving in our nation's government, and hopefully some of the next people who will do that in the years to come are here in this room. If there are any questions you still have or things you're unclear about, I'll remind people this is a double header week, so on Thursday evening, U.S. Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz will be visiting the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy, and then Friday morning we have an event here in this room on the future of the energy grid. Thank you, Brian. Please join me in thanking Brian Deese.
Thank you very much.